but I.
Okay, so we're going to start, and just to introduce Diana, because this is going to be recorded and go up on YouTube. She's a former Latin teacher who traded in the classical world for classic cocktails, I like to say. And after she earned a master's degree in food studies from NYU, where she teaches a graduate seminar on the history, culture, and politics of drinking, and something that is piquing everybody's interest, I don't know if you're starting this again yet, leads a Prohibition walking tour in New York City. Have you started that up again, or?
I haven't resumed doing that yet. I'm still
still little, yeah.
But probably this out. Well, I can't say anything. I just don't know what's going to happen. But
right.
I'm trying to start again this autumn. But we'll see what happens.
We'll see. Closer to home, she's the co-founder of Night Owl Hospitality, a cocktail catering company in Asbury Park, and also Asbury Park Whiskey Club. She's also an avid traveler, and she visited a total of 50 different countries by the time she was 50, and has, of course, enjoyed cocktails where the countries had cocktails, and sort of tasted, I'm sure, and shared in whatever liquor drinks or alcoholic drinks were available to her. So take it away, Diana.
All right, I'm just changing my name because somehow I became you.
Yeah, I don't know how. Yeah, I don't know why. You know what? Probably the way I sent you the link.
Maybe, right. But that's what I make. Get the record straight that this is Diana Patel. Hi, everybody. Hi, Mary Ellen. Hello, husband. Hello, everybody else who's watching. I'm really happy to be here tonight and talk about one of my favorite subjects, the history of the cocktail, which is a uniquely American culinary creation that dates back to the 19th century, at least the 19th century, that then went out into the world. It was lost for a while, thanks to Prohibition. And within the past 20 years, we and the world have regained knowledge of the classic American cocktail. And we're currently in a cocktail, a new golden age of the cocktail and drinking. So tonight, some of my goals are, well, let's see, what are my 3 goals for tonight? I would say to emphasize the American origins of the cocktail that then has become this global phenomenon. 2, to emphasize that we are in this golden age of drinking, including the cocktail. And 3, tonight's going to be a part hands-on cocktail making class. And I'm going to be showing 3 different cocktail making techniques: shaken, stirred, which you kind of know from James Bond, shaken and stirred, and built in a glass. And I will go over when cocktails are usually stirred, when they're shaken, and when they're built in a glass. And I guess my 4th goal is to have some fun while also being informative. I know you're all on mute, but if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And when appropriate, you can come off of mute and ask me some questions too. We'll make this less of like a library online talk, maybe a little bit more like a barroom session. So we'll have a little chatting, hopefully. I'll be going in and out of screen share. Primarily for the historical components, I'll be showing a PowerPoint presentation, and then I'll come out of screen share to make cocktails, 3 of them, and that would be a good time to come off of mute and ask any questions if you have any. And Mary Ellen, I see you like a Negroni, and a mark of this golden age of drinking that we're in is that not only can you get a good Negroni in Italy, its birthplace, but you can also get one in New York City, of course. But you could get one in Des Moines, Iowa. You can get one in Oslo, Norway. It's just the people's knowledge of cocktails is really solid all throughout the world. And I see that your husband Lee prefers bourbon. Yeah, again, just as a cocktail is classically American, so is bourbon. And a Kentucky Mule, yum. So that's with ginger beer, right? Ginger beer and bourbon, a little lime juice. Delicious. All right, so I'm going to go into screen share and get this story started on the history of the cocktail. So let me go on in, share. Okay. Oopsie, this is my old slide. Let me go. Boop, boop. There we go. So history of the cocktail from the 19th century to the present. And the way that I like to frame this long history is talking about the birth, death, and rebirth of the cocktail in America, its birthplace. And for each one of those phases, its birth, death, and rebirth, I'm going to have a cocktail that corresponds with that phase of its life cycle, and each one of those cocktails will employ a different cocktail making technique. Okay. That's a little blurb here. So you can see now these first 3 points are the 3 phases, and then I'm also going to be incorporating into that those 3 phases a little bit about women and the cocktail and how ice influenced the cocktail as well. All right. So birth of the cocktail, our first phase. Well, it's interesting to note that the cocktail really hasn't been around all that long. And what I'm talking about is that humans have been intentionally consuming alcohol for at least 9,000 years. And how do we know that? Well, from archaeological evidence, these pieces of pottery come from the Yellow River Valley in China from 7,000 BCE, so 9,000 years ago. And chemical analysis of the pottery showed that these pots contain some sort of mixed fermented beverage, something like along the lines of a wine from hawthorn fruit or grapes, something like sake from rice, and then mead, fermented honey. So as I said, humans have been intentionally consuming alcohol for at least 9,000 years, but the cocktail, does anybody have a sense? You can put into chat how long the cocktail has been around for. Judy, do you remember from last time, or Mary Ellen or Lee?
No.
Do you guys want to say?
Probably, well, I don't know if it was cocktails, maybe 300 years?
Oh, you're pretty close. Mary Ellen and Lee, do you guys want to venture a guess?
You can unmute if you want.
Well, the clue, of course, is in the title of the talk that the cocktail dates back to the early 19th century.
Oh, okay.
So a little trick question for you guys. And how do we know when the cocktail originated? Well, we're going to go from archaeological evidence to linguistic evidence, and we'll turn to the Oxford English Dictionary, which always defines words and then gives some of the earliest examples of that word in use in English. And we'll look here to the definition from 1806 in Hudson, New York, in the Hudson Valley, just a bit north of New York City. And this use of the cocktail, the word cocktail in 1806, is the first time that the cocktail is defined in English. And the cocktail, you'll see, is a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. So in 1806, the cocktail, which I call cocktail with a capital C, is a very specific drink. Just as a daiquiri is different from a margarita, or a martini is different from a Manhattan, or a Kentucky Mule is different from a mint julep. Each one of those drinks are different, and they fall under the umbrella category of cocktail with a small c, all these different mixed drinks. In 1806, cocktail with a capital C was its own drink. And what went into it was what's defined here: a stimulating liquor, so any kind of spirit. Actually, sometimes there was made with champagne, so a wine, sugar, water, and bitters. Now, does anybody know what cocktail we would call this today? Cocktail with a small c. Judy, Mary Ellen, Lee, I hope you know, you bourbon drinker.
Oh.
Well, this is an old fashioned.
Oh.
So in 1806, actually, an old fashioned would have been a new fashion. I will get into how it changed from being called a cocktail to an old fashioned, or cocktail with a capital C to an old fashioned. But yes, this is what it is. And what distinguished a cocktail with a capital C from all other drinks of this time period was the addition of bitters. And bitters, and here I've got Angostura bitters right here, the classic one that almost every bar and even home bar will have. These bitters originate from the medicinal tradition. Most alcohol actually started off as some sort of medicine, and then transferred itself from the realm of medicine into the realm of pleasure, just like often happens with drugs as well. And bitters come originally patent medicines that were created to deal with all different types of ailments. This was Angostura bitters was created by a German doctor in the army of Simon Bolivar to help the fighting men with stomach ailments and whatnot. And then it moved from Venezuela, where he created it, to Trinidad. But anyway, so the addition of bitters was what made a cocktail with a capital C a cocktail with a capital C back in 1806. But then during the course of the 19th century, the cocktail did change its definition. So here from 1889, it went from that specific drink to an umbrella category drink of an American drink, strong, stimulating, cold. In 1945, the great Baltimore satirist and essayist, journalist H.L. Mencken called the cocktail the greatest of the contributions of the American way of life to the salvation of mankind. You can decide after my talk if you agree, but the cocktail is this great American creation. And then today, a cocktail, again, is very nebulous. You don't even need to have spirits in a cocktail, according to Webster's. It could have wine in it, and just basically just has to be cold with some sort of mixture of things. But let's go back to our old-fashioned / cocktail with a capital C and make one ourselves. And if you wouldn't mind, Judy, cutting and pasting the old-fashioned into the chat, I'll come out of screen share.
Okay, let me do this. Oops, there. Oops, it didn't do the whole thing. Oh, yes, it did. Okay, let me just post this. There you go.
Okay, I'm gonna pin me. And I don't know if you know how to spotlight me, Judy, that way.
Yes, I do. I think, wait, I have to go here, speaker view. Oops, no, not you. Okay, when you start to talk, I'll mute.
Okay, well, else you can spotlight me too. All right, so we're gonna make an old fashioned, but in 1806, as I joked, it would have been called a new fashioned. But more specifically, it would have been called a whiskey cocktail, because since an 1806 capital C cocktail could be made with any kind of spirit, you could get a cognac cocktail, you could get a brandy cocktail, you could get a gin cocktail, you could get a champagne cocktail. So an old fashioned would have been known as a whiskey cocktail with a capital C. Now, a cocktail and our old fashioned is a stirred drink. And I should mention when you should stir drink and when you should shake a drink as promised. Now, you shake a drink if it has juice of any kind, dairy of any kind, like ice cream or cream. And also if it has any part of the egg, if it has egg white, egg yolk, or the whole egg, then you're going to shake the drink because you want to aerate it and get all those ingredients incorporated into one another and lighten up those heavy ingredients with the air in it. Whereas if a drink doesn't have juice, doesn't have dairy of any kind, doesn't have any part of the egg, then you tend to want to stir it because you don't want to aerate it. You don't want to liven it up. You want to actually keep it kind of heavy and silky and smooth. So since our old fashioned, let's see here, Judy should have put this in the chat for us. There we go. You can see that there is no juice, dairy, or egg in it. All right, so we're going to stir our drink. And when you use, and this is a mixing glass, and then I always use a cocktail measure called a jigger, because there are parallels of cocktail making to baking as opposed to cooking, meaning when you cook something, you can often just like put a little something of that in there, put a little something about this in there, and it comes out usually fine. Whereas with baking, you need to be precise, because if you don't have the right ratio of flat fat to flour to water, you're not going to get a crispy crust. If you don't have enough leavening agent in there, your cake isn't going to rise, your bread isn't going to rise. So cocktails, you could wing everything together, but if you want to have a harmonious whole of your drink to really elevate that drink experience, you want to have the correct ratios of the strong alcohol to the weakness of maybe the juice, or the acidity of the juice, or the bitters in there. So measuring this, all your ingredients helps maintain that balance of ratio, and then you get a good drink. And also, the next thing I'm going to mention is when you're making a drink in a cocktail shaker or a mixing glass, don't put ice in yet, because then you run the risk of throwing off balance your drink by over dilution. All right, so let's make our drink, and it's a good idea too to start with the cheapest ingredients first, so that if you mess up your drink and you just start over again, you haven't wasted your expensive stuff. So we're going to start with 1/4 ounce of simple syrup. That's just equal parts sugar and hot water. And you make a simple syrup so that the sugar gets incorporated into the drink easily. If it's just granulated sugar, it can kind of just stay at the bottom of your glass, which is not so tasty. Then we're going to put in our bitters. Again, this is what really distinguishes this as a cocktail with a capital C. It says 2 dashes, and this looks like 2 dashes. Dunk, 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 dunk. That's how I do it. So I'm going to take off the lid and do it now. And as I mentioned, I'm going to make a old fashioned with bourbon. You can also make it with rye. And I chose this because Penelope bourbon is created by a Monmouth County resident, Michael Paldini of Penelope bourbon, even though it's distilled in Indiana. So 2 ounces in there. Again, no ice yet. And now we'll add some ice. It's already melting. And it's good to put ice up above the liquid line. You want to have a lot of ice in there to make sure everything kind of keeps cold and you don't over dilute. So I should ask you, Mary Ellen, should a Negroni be shaken or stirred? You can put in the chat if you want. And as you do that, I'll stir my drink here.
I think it should be stirred.
How come?
Because there's no cream, no juice, and what was the third thing?
No egg. No
egg. No.
But I know that Stanley Tucci likes to shake his Negronis. That was an internet sensation during the pandemic. Right. And it's like a really light and lovely Negroni, but sometimes you kind of just want that heavy, silky, delicious Negroni. You know, you can really taste all the bitterness. So when I'm stirring this, you can see the ice kind of all moving around together. It's doing 3 things. It's chilling my drink. It is diluting the drink, which actually you do want to. And it's mixing all the ingredients together. So I can feel it, like, ooh, that's nice and cold. I can also hear the ice isn't clinking as pronounced in a pronounced way, because it's melting and kind of softening. So I'm like, okay, let's get this drink in a glass before it over dilutes. So I have my old fashioned glass here. See if I can push me back a little bit more. There we go. And you want to strain out the ice with a cocktail strainer, because again, this ice is getting too diluted. All right. And then I'm going to get fancy, and I have a nice big ice ball here, which I just made myself. And the final ingredient is an orange twist, which isn't just there for decoration. It's there because it contributes citrus oils and aroma, which really bind the drink together. And to make a twist, you use a cocktail peeler and you have your whole orange. You can also use a lemon if you made your old fashioned with rye, and you need to concentrate so you don't get your fingers, you don't graze your fingers. I'm holding my fingers away. I'm gonna cut off a nice, you see I went quiet because I'm concentrating. Cut off a nice thick piece of citrus. There's the orange side. There's the white pith side. What you want to do is have the orange colored side over your drink and give it a little pinch. And that expresses the citrus over the top of your drink. And then you can rub the orange peel around it, which also gets the citrus in there as well. Drop it on in. And voila. Our old fashioned, which again, back in 1806 would have been called a whiskey cocktail with a capital C. All right, let's go on back into screen share. Any questions at all? No? Okay, I'll keep going then.
Well,
Yeah?
that little jigger thing that you had, is that an ounce, 1 ounce?
Okay. Oh, that's good to, I'm glad you're asking. My jigger has 2 sides. It has, this part is 2 ounces, and there's actually a line in there showing 1.5 ounces. You probably can't see it, but in there. And then the smaller side, this is 1 ounce, and then there's markers in there for 1/2 ounce and 3/4 of an ounce. So that's what I was using. Let me see if I got my other one here for you to see. I do. This is a cool one that's all in one by OXO. And it's slanted, and in there are markings for 1/4 ounce, 1/2 ounce, ounce, 1.5 ounces, and 2 ounces. So this is another good one to use. But Judy also put in the chat that if you don't have a jigger, you can just use tablespoons. So, and 2 ounces is 4 tablespoons, 1 ounce is 2 tablespoons. So in a pinch, you can do that as well. All right. Any other questions at all? All right, let's move on. I promised I'd talk a little bit about ice. But before I talk about ice, I want to just say a couple more things about our cocktail with a capital C. As I've said a few times, what distinguished a cocktail with a capital C of all other drinks from this time period was the addition of bitters. I also mentioned that bitters come from a medicinal background. They were made with different ailments in mind. So if you're adding medicine to a drink, it's not really a polite thing to do. Meaning, like, what would you think of me if I told you all that I usually start every morning by having some Alka-Seltzer and I put a shot of vodka in it? Or that if I have a White Russian and I put Pepto-Bismol in it to make it a Pink Russian? And what would you say too if I drank it at room temperature? You would think, ooh, this woman has a problem. We probably won't invite her back for other Zoom talks. That here I am, or like the equivalent of putting like NyQuil in my beer is what I've said, because you're putting medicine into alcohol. So who's doing that, right? Not the most savory sort of folks. It's back in the early 19th century, the people consuming cocktails with capital C were men primarily of the sporting class. These men that just like to have a good time, spend their last pennies on women, on gambling, the horses, and just having a drink. So they would often drink quite a bit. And in the morning, they would drink a cocktail with a capital C as a hangover helper. And the cocktail for most of the first half of the 19th century wasn't iced. And it was considered sort of more medicinal than it was something pleasurable. Just like, people have Alka-Seltzer to soothe their stomachs after a night of hard drinking. That's what cocktail with a capital C did as well. But then through the course of the 19th century, what became the defining element of a cocktail was not bitters so much as ice. And we saw that in the definitions of the cocktail, that by now with Webster's, it's like a cocktail is basically just kind of mixed cold drink. And even by the late 1880s in the Century Dictionary, it called it a cold and stimulating drink. So how did ice get into the cocktail? What was originally sort of like a little bit of the hair of the dog for these men of the sporting class. Well, I should point out that the ice trade in the United States didn't start until 1805. And actually that was, it didn't start anywhere in the world until 1805. First happened up in Massachusetts with Frederick Tudor. This image is actually from a lake in upstate New York. So the ice trade did start spreading throughout the Americas. And then also ice started being shipped throughout the world. One of the first places Frederick Tudor brought ice was to Martinique in the Caribbean. Ice at first, from the ice trade, was considered luxury. In fact, Mark Twain said that ice is like jewelry, only the rich can wear it. But as the ice trade became more more regular, it went from something luxurious to something essential. So hotels would rely on ice to keep food preserved for a long period of time. Breweries would rely on ice so they could brew all year round, and because during the hot months they couldn't brew. And then it went to something sort of delicious, that if there was ice that could be used for something non-essential, was often for ice cream. But then eventually ice did make its way into drinks, and perhaps the gateway drugs, the gateway drinks for ice drinks were, the julep and the sherry cobbler, which again would have originally been drunk without ice. I mean, it's hard to imagine the mint julep without ice, but that's how it was. But once ice got into these drinks in the 1850s or so, that's when things became like, oh, what an added bonus. Like, how deliciously refreshing to have ice in our drinks. And then at some point, ice found its way into cocktail with a capital C. There are some theories that maybe it was the 49ers out in California, because these would definitely been sort of hardened men that would have liked a drink or two or three or four or five, and they had the money to pay for ice to go into their drinks. And then that's how it happened. So once ice found its way into a cocktail with a capital C, it went from this drink of urgency in the morning, you know, you just shoot it back, to something that maybe you could sip and savor and enjoy. Once ice found its way into the cocktail, that's when we get the birth of the mixologist, because the bartender or mixologist has to learn how to cut ice, because it's coming in big commercial blocks. And then he also has to develop and change his techniques for making drinks once there's ice in there as well. So this is really the rise of the mixologist. And we think of the word mixologist as something quite new, but it dates back from I think 1856. And this Jerry Thomas's Bartender's Guide, you can see it's from 1862. This is considered the first cocktail book ever written, and Jerry Thomas is known as the professor or the father of mixology because of his writing this first cocktail book. I can see here, and then you get a lot of flair as well at this time, so to speak. This is not an ice drink. This is the opposite. This is a flaming drink that he's tossing flaming spirit from drink to drink here. And then once ice goes into drinks, do you remember in our definition of the cocktail, there had to be spirit of any kind, bitters, and water, but also sugar. That once sugar gets involved, you start having to use sugar syrups instead of granulated sugar. And you'll know why this is if you ever try to put granulated sugar into your iced coffee, how it just sinks to the bottom. It's better to use simple syrup like we use for old fashioned, because it gets incorporated in. But once bartenders start making syrups, they're like, what other kind of syrupy sweeteners can we put in there? And that's when liqueurs start coming into cocktails with a capital C, and vermouth. So actually the old fashioned morphs into the martini and into the Manhattan by the 1880s. So over the course of about 70 to 80 years, because that sugar then gets swapped out for vermouth. And so a gin cocktail with a capital C, you add some vermouth, you get a martini. The whiskey cocktail with a capital C, you swap out the sugar for sweet vermouth, and voila, you have a Manhattan. And not only is there more flair, but there's more ingredients, equipment that needs to come into play. So for instance, straws in cocktails now start coming into being, because you don't want to get your teeth cold from ice. And also you need cocktail strainers to keep ice out of your drinks. So this is, ice profoundly changes how drinks are made and the ingredients that go into them, but it also changes profoundly how drinks are perceived, that they go from being this unsavory concoction only consumed in the morning by the men of the sporting class to men in very swank hotels. This is the Hoffman House in New York City, probably in the late 1880s. So the metaphorical 1% enjoying their cocktails. And at this time period is when most classic cocktails are invented, like the martini, like the well, sorry, like the Manhattan. And it's also now that the whiskey cocktail changes its name to the old fashioned, because as I mentioned, all those ingredients start finding their way into the cocktail with a capital C. And you know, a little liqueur, maybe a little absinthe, some vermouth. And so you can imagine some guy from the 1850s who's used to his whiskey cocktail being nothing more than just sugar, water, bitters, spirit. And he doesn't want all the other junk in there. So he just wants, I want a whiskey cocktail the old fashioned way, you know, dating back to 1806. So that's how the old fashioned took over the name of the whiskey cocktail. And this time period is the zenith of the American cocktail, coinciding with the Gilded Age in America. So we're talking, you know, 1880s up until until Prohibition. But I'll say one thing, I did want to mention women in the cocktail as well, because when talking about the birth of the cocktail in America, it's often this very masculinized thing about who's drinking them, who's making them, who's inventing them. But women had a role to play too. And that's all now coming out in the history. I don't know if you all saw in the New York Times food section about a month ago, there was an article profiling Dr. Nicola Nice, who's the inventor of a gin cordial, and she's collecting recipe books showing how women played a role in creation of cocktails and bringing them into the home. Case in point is this Elizabeth Beaton's book of household management that came out just a few years before the Jerry Thomas's Bartender's Guide. Whereas Jerry Thomas's Bartender's Guide only sold about 8,000 copies and went out of print, Elizabeth Beaton's book of household management that includes recipes for cordials and hostessing, and her book sold 2 million copies by 1868 and has never ever gone out of print. So it's interesting to sort of dive in and see how women influence the consumption, perception, and creation of the cocktail. But alas, our story is not going to take a little bit of a turn to the death of the cocktail. So we've left the cocktail at its zenith, which is from 1880s to Prohibition, which starts in 1920. And it wasn't so much that alcohol disappeared, because we know that people were still drinking during Prohibition. There were lots of different, you know, of the speakeasies. This is a 21 Club in Manhattan, which originated as a speakeasy on 51st Street, I think. So people were consuming, but you know, you no longer have this expert class of bartenders like Jerry Thomas, because when Prohibition happens, many of them leave the country and take their knowledge of how to make a good cocktail with lowercase c and a capital C with them. They leave for places like London, Paris, Nice, Havana. And instead, what people want during Prohibition is just an easy way to down a drink, and also to mask the taste of the inferior quality of alcohol that was being consumed during Prohibition. And we have long lived the legacy of Prohibition with cocktails right up until like the 2000s, so only about 20 years ago. And the legacy of that is that we in America and lots of places throughout the world have lost the fine art of making a cocktail. The cocktail never went away, but it definitely wasn't this greatest contribution of mankind like Mencken claimed that the cocktail was. And an analogy I make is, think about pasta. Think about how you might make pasta at home, spaghetti at home. And think about spaghetti at the Olive Garden. Think about spaghetti, I don't know, at Angelica's and Seabright. Think about spaghetti that you would get in Italy. It's all spaghetti, right? And it's good, but think about the different qualities of it. And it's only sort of in the last 30 years or so, 30, 40 years that we in America realize like spaghetti isn't just what you get out of a can or what you get at your local red sauce joint, that it can be really like exquisitely made with fine ingredients and lots of attention to detail and with good technique. So you know that there's varying degrees of pasta. So too the cocktail. The cocktail, it suffered because of this loss of knowledge that happened during Prohibition. And in addition, it suffered too because of convenience. So you hear the soda gun, that no longer were drinks, mixed drinks being made with fresh lime juice or with fancy imported cordials or fresh made tonic syrups. Everything came out of a soda gun with high fructose corn syrup. And then also drinks were not so much the personal creations, unique creations of skilled bartenders. They became the creations of boardrooms just trying to sell alcohol. And the case in point here is the Moscow Mule, which was sort of a brainchild of Smirnoff vodka when it was trying to break into the US market. It's hard to imagine that there was a time when vodka really wasn't all that popular, it needed to be marketed, but such was the case. And what I think exemplifies the downturn of the cocktail in a way is a highball. And there's nothing wrong with a highball. A good highball is an amazing drink, but they became to dominate mixed drinks in the States. And that is in some ways the legacy of Prohibition. Again, just getting something fizzy and sweet and mixing it with some sort of spirit and downing it. The gin Rickey, I selected the gin Rickey as a highball because actually it is a pre-Prohibition drink. It dates back to the late 1800s, started in Missouri, and by somebody who was working in government and came to Washington, D.C. and brought the gin Rickey with him. Actually, back in the day, it was a whiskey Rickey, but then gin was a substitute and became the default Rickey. There's nobody really drinks gin Rickeys anymore. So I'm going to come out of screen share. And Judy, I know you've stepped away for a second, but if you wouldn't mind putting the drink into the chat, that'd be good. So the method for this drink is easy peasy, and that's the appeal of the highball, is that it doesn't really need all that much equipment, because you don't need a cocktail shaker. You don't need a mixing glass. All you need is the glass.
Sorry, I got distracted. Are we doing gin Rickey?
Yes.
Okay, I'll put that in. I'm sorry. My director was trying desperately to get in, but she couldn't. So, okay. That's where I was. Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
In the chat box. Sorry.
All right. So yeah, highballs are traditionally just built in the glass. So other examples are highballs, gin and tonics, whiskey sodas, vodka clubs, rum and cokes, all right, you just do in a glass. And this is when I would add ice first. Really want to start chilling everything down as soon as it gets in there, because you're not shaking or really stirring it. So I'm going to maybe do about 3/4. And then we'll put in, excuse my big bottle of gin. This is a birthday present to me that I'm still working my way through. I'm going to start with the gin first, even though I did tell you that it's often good to start with the cheapest ingredient first. So I decided to use this one instead, this jigger. I'm going to put 2 ounces of gin in. And then we're going to put just a 1/2 ounce, of course, fresh lime juice. It doesn't look fresh, but it is freshly squeezed, and it's just kind of a little sort of like cloudy. So a 1/2 ounce of that. You can add sugar, but the original gin Rickey was more of what's called a cooler, that it wasn't sweetened. And it's actually kind of delightful. It's a bit tart for our modern palates, but it's good. I'm just going to give it a quick little stir. And then going to add some soda water. And you don't really have to measure it, but it's kind of good, just again, so you have the proportions. That was 4 ounces. And if you want to, you could add a little bit more, ice on top. Give it a little stir as well to get that soda water throughout, but you don't want to stir it too vigorously because you don't want it to dilute. You don't want to lose all those bubbles. And then you can just put a little extra spritz of lime in there. And there you have your cooling gin Ricky. Ooh. Without any sugar in there. Ooh, it's tart and refreshing and delicious. So that's so again, one of the marks of the legacy of Prohibition is just the ease of the drink. And, you know, just like throwing pasta in a boiling pot, not checking to see if it's al dente, just pouring pasta sauce from a jar in and not getting fresh Jersey tomatoes and making your own sauce and making sure you're cooking the pasta properly and rapidly boiling salted water, right? Just easy peasy became the way of drinking. And also we forgot that there was any other kind of drinks out there. We forgot what the old fashioned was really like. The martini was really like and we'll find out what the daiquiri was really like. All right, so let's carry on and point out that one of the other legacies of Prohibition is that we actually got women in the bar. That before Prohibition, that went from 1920 to 1933, women really didn't drink in public, and they definitely didn't drink in public in the company of men. I mean, polite women, we should say. I'm sure there was drinking, women and men drank together in public, but sort of the polite thing was that that did not happen. But when drinking was driven underground, sort of all social rules went out the window, and men and women did drink together in public, albeit surreptitiously, because you weren't supposed to be drinking. And once Prohibition was repealed in 1933, men and women continued drinking together. This is an interesting thing to think about. All right. So now we've left our cocktail at its lowest point. Very few skilled bartenders, very little knowledge of what makes a good cocktail. But then, we have the rebirth of the cocktail, which starts in the mid to late 1990s, and it's still on this path of, on this great path of rediscovery and invention and appreciation. I mean, hence, for instance, my giving a talk about it, right? And these are two key players in our area that contributed to the rebirth of the cocktail. This is Sasha Petrosky, who last died a few years ago in his 40s. He opened a bar in the Lower East Side called Milk and Honey. And you can see that everything he's doing here at his bar, Milk and Honey, is the antithesis of the soda gun. He is, impeccably dressed. He's using beautiful glassware for his drink. He's having thoughtful garnishes. This is a lemon twist. It's not some sort of sad brown lime that he's adding in there. He's got good spirits in the background. He's using good technique. And when people went to his bar, Milk and Honey, their minds were sort of blown. It's like, oh my goodness, is this what cocktails really are? And it's really what cocktails really were, before Prohibition, that then Sasha helped bring back to the world. A person who also contributed to it greatly is Audrey Saunders. She had a bar down on Houston Street in New York City called the Pegu Club, opened in 2005. So 6 years after Sasha opened his bar, Milk and Honey. Sadly, Audrey Saunders' Pegu Club closed because of COVID and probably won't open. But what her legacy is that she trained many bartenders worked at her bar, because again, so few people, even in 2005, were creating these exquisite craft cocktails in the vein of pre-Prohibition style cocktails. And so they worked for Audrey and then went on to open their own world-class bars like PDT, Please Don't Tell Me, Please Don't Tell, I should say, or Death & Co. Lots of great bars in New York City. And the ground zero, so to speak, of the rebirth of the cocktail, we saw that Sasha Petrosky was behind it and Audrey Saunders, but even before that is this gentleman, Dale de Graaf, who was pegged by Joe Baum, the great restaurateur. He was the one behind Windows of the World in the World Trade Center that used to be the highest grossing restaurant in the world until 2001. And when Joe Baum took over the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center, because I should say the Rainbow Room opened just after Prohibition in 1934. And then by the 1980s, it was kind of bedraggled. It wasn't this elite, lovely place anymore. So Joe Baum went about restoring its splendor, and he pegged Dale de Graaf, who was back then a younger gentleman, originally from Long Island, living in California. And he charged Joe Baum charged Dale de Graaf to find a copy of that 1862 Derry Thomas book. And Dale de Graaf did find it. He didn't realize it was out of print, but he did find a copy. And then he reads this book, and it's not an instruction manual that somebody in the 1980s, 1990s would kind of understand. In addition, so many of the ingredients that Derry Thomas mentions in his bartending book is no longer coming into the United States, again, because of Prohibition. You know, maraschino liqueur is not coming in. Like creme de violette's not coming anymore, like all these Amaros, probably there's very little Campari, but Dale de Graaf figures it out. And because he's a bartender in the Rainbow Room, people around the world come and take notice of what he's doing. And in addition, he's using fresh juices, nothing pre-made. And it's New York City, so people take notice. In addition, the AP Wire is in Rockefeller Plaza as well. So journalists were coming in and seeing what he was doing. And then the signal gets sent out to the world that interesting things are happening with the cocktail. I should say Audrey Saunders actually trained under Dale de Graaf, and then she opened Pegu Club, which then trained all these other bartenders that went on to open these amazing bars in New York City that are still around and still get accolades. So when I'm talking about the rebirth of the cocktail and this rebirth of the craft cocktail, I came up with these tenets to sort of describe what distinguishes a craft cocktail from just a regular old cocktail or mixed drink. And again, I think about that analogy of throwing pasta in a pot of like tepid water versus going to a great restaurant in Italy to get pasta, right? There's things that separate the pasta you make at home from the pasta you get at a restaurant. And some of these things, like you're going to be using the recipe is going to come from a formula from a classic cocktail where all the proportions of ingredients have been worked out. Good techniques. You're going to stir a cocktail when you should stir a cocktail, shake a cocktail when you should shake it, do it for the right amount of time so it doesn't get over diluted. Appropriate glassware. Every drink should have its right style and shape of glass. High quality ingredients and juices, good ice that doesn't melt too quickly, it's clear, its appropriate amount is used. Thoughtful garnishes, just like we saw Sasha Petrosky using that little lemon twist instead of like a browning orange or lime wedge. And then with it too, exquisite hospitality, because we can just drink at home if we want to. One of the reasons we go out is to get that experience of having a gracious host behind the bar and being with other people as well. So a drink that I think exemplifies sort of the rebirth of the cocktail is the daiquiri, because of what happened to the drink, to mixed drinks after Prohibition, sort of got bastardized and cheapened, right? When we think daiquiris, we think of prefab high fructose corn mixes that are thrown into a slushy machine. But the daiquiri is this deliciously simple drink. All it is, you can see from this recipe, if Jude, if you could put in the chat, that'd be good. Thank you. Or maybe you already have. It's just rum, lime juice, and sugar, and that's it. And it's come to be known as the daiquiri, sort of like the bartender's handshake, because good bartenders will judge other bartenders by how well they make a daiquiri, their choice of rum, whether they know that the daiquiri shouldn't come out of a slushy machine, that it should be just this lovely shaken drink. They'll judge the bartender by the proportions. This is the portions I came up with: 2 ounces to 3/4 ounces fresh lime juice, to 3/4 ounce simple syrup. Some people mess around those proportions. Could be 2 ounces of rum to 1 ounce of lime juice to 1/2 ounce of simple syrup. So because it's such a simple drink, those little tweaks can really affect the overall quality of this drink. Now, why is this drink shaken? Well, Mary Ellen or Judy or Lee?
Lime juice.
Yes, right, exactly. That because of the juice in there, this drink is going to be shaken. So we're going to end our talk Wait, before I go to screen share, I'll just show me. This is me. This is my pre-COVID haircut. I haven't cut my hair since before COVID. Same apron, but different hair. And just my contact information before I come off of screen share to make the daiquiri with you. The name of my company's Night Owl Hospitality. I do talks. I do cocktail making classes and cocktail catering. And when we can do it safely again, I do tourists as well. Okay, so let me come out of screen share, be with you all again, and let's make our shaken daiquiri. And if you want to go to a bar in New York City and show that you know your stuff, Mary Ellen, definitely for sure asking for Negroni will get you your props, but asking bartenders like, hey, I'd like to have a daiquiri. How do you like to make your daiquiris? What kind of rum do you like to put into it? Then you'll be like, oh, this person knows a little bit something. So we're shaking this drink. And I am using what's called a Boston shaker. Sometimes you use those one-piece shakers that have that look like little bullets. Those are good. They're called cobbler shakers, but I find that the top often gets stuck on there through the vacuum seal, and I like trying to get the top off, and I want my drink. This is easier to sort of separate. It's got two parts. Sometimes the bottom part can be also stainless steel as well. I like the glass because then you can see what's going into your drink. Again, we're not adding ice in there yet, and on that I need to get a little bit more ice. Because we don't want to have over diluted or melting ice. All right, not putting ice in yet. We're going to put our ingredients. And again, we're going to start with our cheapest ingredients first. So let's start with simple syrup. And put in 3/4 ounce. Finish my simple syrup. You can keep it in the fridge for a while. Pour that in. Then our fresh lime juice. And 3/4 ounce of that as well. And before I carry on, I failed to do a step that I like to do. You know how now mixed drinks are really defined by their being cold. What's a good thing to do to ensure that everything's cold is to make sure your glass is cold. And you can do that by putting it in the fridge before you make your drink, or freezer, I should say, before making drink. Or you can do this. I just have some ice and water. And this, you can just chill down your drink as you're making your drink. So I'll just put it over to the side. Oh, I found another little ice cube. Put that in. So our drink in progress already has the simple syrup and lime juice. And now I'm going to add some white rum. And again, the type of rum you use is really going to change the nature of this drink too, because it is such a simple drink, just very few ingredients. So I'm going to go all the way up to the tippy top of this for 2 ounces. Pour that in. And now you're going to add your ice, and you're going to add a good amount of it. You can see I skimped on the ice. And when you put the top on, if you're using this type of shaker, you don't put it straight over. You put it a little bit of an angle, and that gets a nice little seal, so you know that liquid won't go everywhere. I'm going to flip it over, hold on to the glass part on top. So again, we don't, in case the glass goes flying, so the glass won't go flying. Now we're going to give it a good shake. Ready? And when, oh, you can't really quite see it right now, but maybe I'll do a couple more shakes. Oh, yeah, I can see now the frost on the glass, on the tin, I should say. So I know that I've shaken it enough because it's getting quite cold, almost like unbearably so. And when you're shaking the drink, you're doing 4 things. You're mixing things together forcibly. You're diluting what you want to do. You're chilling, of course. And that additional thing that you do not get when you stir a drink is that aeration to make it kind of light and frothy. Now, if you can't get it off, because sometimes that happens, you're like, oh, you can just give it a little whack. And there you go. Comes right off. Now I'm going to dump out the chilling ice. So our glass should be nice and cold now too. Strain out the bad ice, the used ice. Yeah. And we're just going to garnish it with a little lime wheel. I'm just going to float it on top, I think, maybe. And there is a sublime daiquiri, and a drink that it was kind of almost lost until we've all discovered our native craft of the cocktail. Ooh, that's delicious. So I'll come back in. I think we've hit the 8 o'clock mark. Mary Ellen or Judy, any questions at all before we call it quits?
I just wanted to ask, I know a lot of times that champagne gets served in the daiquiri glass, and they say that it's really not good, that champagne should be served in a high flute because otherwise all of the bubbles or the effervescence goes away. Is that true? Or, I mean, how do you decide what kind of a glass to serve a drink in?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, for wines and whatnot, it's not really my forte. So I think that, you know, when you drink champagne, you're not going to have it sit around for too long, I don't think, for the bubbles to escape. But for cocktails, there is sort of like a legacy of the type of glass that you serve the drinks in. And that's what you're going to go through, what you're going to confirm to. Oftentimes, shaken drinks do come like this, but also some stirred drinks too, like the martini and the Manhattan as well. And you would definitely use this type of glass when you're serving something up, meaning there's no additional ice in it. But if you have a shaken drink that you do want to add ice to, then you would find that would probably go into a rocks glass.
Is there any significance, or is it just historical, the difference that the fact that a martini is usually served in a more something that's more like V-shaped? Or
yeah, but that's more of a sort of a recent invention. I haven't been able to find when that first happened, but if you've ever seen the movie The Thin Man?
Yes, I have them all here. I'm going to now check them out. Right. Okay.
Yeah, the Thin Man, that's Nick and Nora, and they drink their martinis out of the little tiny glasses. So
oh, okay. I never noticed that, but I haven't watched it in a while.
So this would be.
I love those movies.
Yeah, so this is what a martini would sort of more typically being consumed. Okay. It just got supersized, and then that V shape becomes this iconic shape of the martini glass. But I drink my martinis either like in this kind of Nick and Nora style glass, or I'll drink it out of a coupe, because also those shape ones that kind of slosh all around in there. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you. It was very interesting. My husband and I were always wine drinkers, but during COVID, we've spent more money on alcohol at the liquor store than we've spent.
You're probably not alone, Mary Ellen. I'm sure you're not alone.
So we have been experimenting with different cocktails, and it really does make a difference, how it's made. And even sometimes I try to make things at home. We made a Negroni the other night, following directions that we found online, but it wasn't quite right. So I had to kind of doctor it up. So it's, it is a skill. And if you find a good bartender, it makes a difference.
And if you are making it home, it makes a difference finding a good cocktail book. My go-to is the Death & Co. cocktail book. I find that they cover the classics as well as some new ones and share some good techniques, and their proportions are usually pretty good. It's called the Spec, which is the recipe. But you're right, there's like lots of different ways to make a Negroni. As I mentioned, Stanley Tucci, you can shake it when it really should be stirred, but you can kind of do whatever you want to do. But that's the thing, is like arriving at the technique and style that you like for your drink.
How do you spell the name of that recipe book?
Death.
D-E-C-K?
Death, like we're all gonna die.
Oh, death. Okay.
Death and Co, like Death and Company.
Oh, okay.
And the bartenders there they did bartend under Audrey Saunders at the Pegu Club. Oh yeah, I can write it. Oh yeah, thank you, Mary Ellen. Yep, that's it, Death and Co. That's a great resource, I find. It's my go-to.
All right, I'll take a look at that.
Great. Well, cheers, everybody. Thanks for having me back, Judy.
Yes, thank you. And we'll talk about maybe doing something in February, Valentine's Day oriented.
You can do warm drinks or something. That'd be kind of fun. Or at the holidays, I can do Dickens drinks.
Okay. Okay. And Mary Ellen, I'll see you tomorrow, I guess. So take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.